The Gambino-Lucchese Genovese alliance between Carlo Gambino, Gaetano Lucchese, and Vito Genovese began with a plot to take over the Mafia Commission by murdering family bosses Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia. At that time, Gambino was Anastasia's new underboss, and Vito Genovese was the underboss for Frank Costello. Their first target was Costello on May 2, 1957. Costello survived the assassination attempt, but immediately decided to retire as boss in favor of Genevese. Their second target was Anastasia on October 25, 1957. The Gallo brothers and others allegedly murdered Anastasia in a Manhattan barbershop. Opening was for Gambino to become the new boss of the now Gambino crime family. After assuming power, Gambino started conspiring with Lucchese to remove their former ally Genevese. In 1959, with the assistance of Luciano, Costello, and Meyer Lansky, Genevese was arrested, and Gambino assumed full control with Lucchese of the Mafia Commission. Under Gambino and Lucchese, the commission pushed Bonanno boss Joseph Bonanno out of power, triggering an internal war in that family. In the 1960s, the commission backed the Gallo brothers in their rebellion against Profaci family boss Joe Profaci. In 1962, Gambino's oldest son Thomas Gambino married Lucchese's daughter, strengthening the Gambino and Lucchese family alliance. Lucchese gave Gambino access into the rackets at the New York airport's rackets he controlled, and Gambino allowed Lucchese into some of their rackets. After Lucchese's death, in July 1967, Gambino used his power over the commission to make Carmine Tramonti the boss of the Lucchese family. Gambino continued the alliance with Tramonti's successor, Anthony Corallo. After Gambino's death, the new Gambino boss continued the alliance with Corallo. The original Gambino-Lucchese alliance dissolved in 1985 after John Gotti ordered the assassination of Castellano without commission approval. The Gambino-Lucchese alliance in 1999 was initiated by acting Lucchese boss Stephen Crea. The two families extorted the construction industry and made millions of dollars in bid rigging. In early 2002, Lucchese capo John Capra worked with Gambino family member acting boss Arnold Squidieri, acting underboss Anthony Magal, and Bronx-based acting capo Gregory De Palma. The group was involved in illegal gambling and extortion activities in Westchester. The members were arrested in 2005, leaving to reveal that Gambino acting capo De Palma had allowed an FBI agent Joaquin Garcia to work undercover with his crew since 2002. In late 2008, Gambino family New Jersey-based acting capo Andrew Marola teamed with Lucchese's Jersey faction acting boss Martin Taxetta in an illegal gambling ring, shaking down unions and extorting car dealerships. Marola was indicted in 2008, and Taxetta was sent back to prison in 2009. The Gambino-Genovese alliance, 1962-1972, was between Carlo Gambino and Genovese family acting boss, front boss, Thomas Eboli. The alliance was short-lived because Eboli borrowed Gambino money that he spent on a drug deal and then lost. The alliance ended with the July 16, 1972 murder of Eboli. The Gambino-Bonanno alliance, 1991-2004, started with John Gotti and new Bonanno family boss, Joseph Massino. As a member of the commission, John Gotti helped the Bonanno family boss Massino regain the lost commission seat for his family that occurred in the early 1970s. The Gambino family helped reorganize the Bonanno family by advising them to stay away from drugs and steer the family toward a more traditional mafia crimes, loan sharking, gambling, stock fraud, and other crimes. With the reorganization of the Bonanno family, they have become almost as strong as the Gambino family in the late 1990s. The Genevese crime family's New Jersey faction controlled organized crime activities within the state of New Jersey. The Jersey faction is divided into multiple crews, each led by a different captain, who oversees illegal criminal activities and labor racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. The Genevese crime family's New Jersey faction has maintained a strong presence in the northern Jersey area since the early Prohibition era. A number of powerful mobsters within the New Jersey faction, such as Guarino Willie Moretti, Gerardo Jerry Catena, and Louis Bobby Manna, have each held positions within the Genovese family's administration. From the 1990s until his death in 2010, Tino the Greek Fiumara was one of the most powerful capo regimes in the New Jersey faction. Early members of the New Jersey faction were under the control of New York City's Masseria family boss Joe Masseria. In January 1920, Prohibition began, and the United States government prohibited the sale of alcoholic beverages. With large illegal profits to gain, many members became bootleggers and were involved in smuggling large amounts of alcohol into New York's speakeasies. At the peak of Prohibition in 1930, violence erupted between the two rival New York City families. The violence became known as the Castellammare War. Joe Masseria with his mafia family battled with Salvatore Maranzano, who was the boss of the Brooklyn-based Castellammare clan, for control over all Italian gangs in the United States on April 15, 1931. Masseria was murdered and replaced as boss by Charles Lucky Luciano, who ended the war with Maranzano. The members of the Masseria New Jersey faction continued working for Luciano as bootleggers. After a few months, on September 10, 1931, Salvatore Maranzano was murdered, and Luciano became the most powerful mobster in America. Luciano decided to restructure all the American mafia families by establishing the commission instead of having a capo dei capi, or boss of all bosses. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the Luciano family's New Jersey faction expanded into other crimes. The most powerful capo regime in the faction was Guarino Willie Moretti, who controlled numerous illegal gambling operations in New Jersey. Moretti formed an alliance with Jewish mobster Abner Longy Zwillman, who the media refer as the Al Capone of New Jersey, because Zwillman had once controlled the majority of the illegal alcohol in Newark. The alliance between Moretti and Zwillman dominated illegal gambling in New Jersey. In early 1937, Newark family boss Gaspare D'Amico fled the U.S. after a foiled hit ordered by Joseph Profaci. The Mafia Commission divided up D'Amico's territory among the Luciano Boardo crew, Galliano Jersey crew, Mangano, Bonanno, Badami family, Profaci and Philadelphia North Jersey crew families. In 1937, family boss Luciano was arrested, leaving Frank the Prime Minister Costello as the new acting boss of the family. Moretti, a cousin to Costello, was promoted to underboss. Zwillman continued to align with the Luciano family, while Moretti was replaced by Newark Capo Ruggiero Richie the Boot Boardo. Zwillman and Boardo were previously enemies fighting for control of territory in Newark, but the two men put their differences aside and focused on controlling illegal gambling throughout Newark. The alliance between Moretti, Zwillman, and Boardo continued to operate peacefully together for years, until Moretti became mentally ill in the early 1950s. A contract hit was put on Moretti, and he was executed while eating lunch on October 4, 1951. The murder of Moretti became a key factor in weakening Frank Costello's leadership position within the Luciano family, as his only major remaining supporter was Mangano family boss Albert Anastasia. A few years earlier, in 1946, Costello's strongest ally and powerful mobster Lucky Luciano was deported into Italy. Costello promoted Vito Genevese to underboss, but Genevese believed the family belonged to him and plotted to take control from Costello. After his promotion to underboss, Genevese gained the support of Lucchese boss Gaetano, Tommy Lucchese, and Mangano underboss Carlo Gambino. In May 1957, Genevese and his allies ordered the assassination of Costello, but failed and only wounded him. The attack made Costello aware that Genevese would never stop, and Costello retired, leaving Genevese as the new boss. Under Genevese's leadership, Gerardo Jerry Catena was promoted to underboss of the family, and also oversaw the New Jersey faction. Catena, an ally of Genevese, depended on Boardo and Angelo De Carlo to help run the faction as his capos. In 1957, Genevese gathered the bosses of the top mafia families for his Appalachian Conference, which ended in the arrest of several bosses and the realization of a nationwide network of organized criminals. After the failed conference, Genevese was closely monitored by the government and arrested in 1959 on a heroin conviction. Zwillman hanged himself on February 27, 1959, upon being summoned to appear at the Valachi hearings. Most of Zwillman's illegal gambling rackets were taken over by members of the Jersey faction. According to the Valachi hearings, the upper administration of the Genevese family included acting boss Thomas Tommy Ryan Eboli, underboss Jerry Catena, and consigliere Michel Mike Miranda. Throughout the 1960s, Catena continued to work with the upper administration. Catena was born on January 8, 1902, in South Orange, New Jersey, to Francesco and Donata Speziale, and subsequently became familiar with legendary mobsters Guarino Willie Moretti, Thomas Greco, Cosmo Gus Frasca, and Abner Longies Willman. He was a vending machine racketeer with interests in People's Express Company, Advance Vending Company, Runyon Vending Sales, and a few more, all based in Newark, New Jersey. Little is known of Catena in his early days of the Luciano crime family, but reportedly he was a soldier in the crew that became the powerful Genevese crew during the late 1920s, headed by later underboss Vito Genevese. As the time passed, and Lucky went to prison and later deportation in the 1940s, Vito organized the shooting of the boss of the Luciano crime family, Frank Costello, in 1957, which forced Costello to retire. Apparently, Catena is to have risen through the ranks, as he was listed as the underboss in the late 1950s, heading the New Jersey faction of the Genovese crime family under the leadership of Don Vito. Later, it has been confirmed that he moved to New York City to join the forces of Charlie Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky during the early 1920s, when the rise of two mafia dons, Joe the Boss and Salvatore Maranzano, began fighting a bloody internal battle called the Castellamarese War. After the imprisonment of Vito Genevese in 1959, a committee ruling panel was to run the Genevese crime family, which consisted of Catena, Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, Thomas Eboli, who was murdered in 1972, and Michel Miranda. This administration continued to run the family throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Gerardo Catena was incarcerated at the Yardville State Prison, now the Garden State Youth Correctional Facility, from 1970 to 1975, because he had refused to testify before the New Jersey State Commission of Investigation. After his incarceration, he was allegedly semi-retired due to illness, and became officially retired after his release in 1975, as he moved to Boca Raton, Florida that same year. Gerardo Catena died of natural causes on April 23, 2000, at the age of 98. Ruggiero Boardo, also known as the Boot, was an Italian-American mobster and powerful capo regime in the New Jersey faction of the Genevese crime family. He was named capo after Willie Moretti was promoted to the position of underboss by Frank Costello. Richie the Boot ruled the greater Newark and North Jersey gang territories for over 3 decades. The Boot, a nickname which he developed in his youth, had been said to have derived from the heavy-footed way he disposed of his gangland foes. In the early 1930s, Boardo was ambushed and seriously wounded with 12 buckshot pellet wounds. He survived. At the time, the press suspected Abner Zwillman was responsible, but later evidence pointed to the members of another rival gang led by the Mazzocchi brothers, whom the Boot subsequently had murdered. None of Richie's gang is above suspicion of planning the murder of their leader, the Newark Evening News reported. There is also said to be men who wanted to see Richie out of the way because of certain women who favored him with their regard. Other likely suspects included the Mazzocchi brothers, Willie Moretti, and even his close friend Al Capone. The number one suspect, however, was Abner Longies Willman, a man sometimes referred to as Gangster Number 2. When the Boot's .38 caliber revolver fell to the hospital floor after the attempt on his life, prosecutors had a case against him. It was an unusual one that appeared to be putting the victim of a crime on trial, rather than the perpetrators. The men who tried to assassinate the Boot were never found, at least by the authorities. The police were convinced the Boot knew who was behind the shooting. In his hospital room, they gave the seriously wounded gangster descriptions of the men who had allegedly shot at him, but the Boot shrugged and said he did not know. In the 1930s, Boardo became a made man, or full member of the Luciano crime family established by Lucky Luciano. In 1957, this family became the Genevese family under boss Vito Genevese. With Abe Zwillman's death in 1959, Boardo became the undisputed mob boss of Newark, who also owned residences in Cuba and Florida, where he had major gambling interests. In April 1969, Richie Boardo was convicted of conspiracy to violate gambling laws. Accordingly, he was sentenced to 2.5 to 3 years in state prison and fined $1,000. He was incarcerated on November 18, 1970, at the New Jersey State Prison, Leesburg, New Jersey. The Boardo family's association with Newark's mayor, Hugh Adonisio, led to Adonisio's conviction in 1969 on racketeering charges. This eliminated Adonisio as a contender to become the next governor of the state of New Jersey. Adonisio was sentenced to 10 years and served 5 years and 2 months in a federal prison. The same federal grand jury that returned an indictment against Adonisio also indicted 14 others, including Richie Boardo's son Anthony Boardo, also known as Tony Boy Boardo. The younger Boardo is believed to have been in control of the Newark underworld at the time. During the criminal proceedings, Tony Boy suffered a heart attack. He was never found by the courts to be healthy enough to stand trial on his extortion and conspiracy charges. Boardo died of natural causes on October 29, 1984, aged 93, and was interred at Holy Cross Cemetery in North Arlington, New Jersey. His son, Anthony Tony Boy Boardo, was also involved in organized crime. At the time of Anthony's death, he was awaiting trial on an indictment that had resulted in the conviction of Mayor of Newark, Hugh Joseph Adonisio. Philip Lombardo was the boss of the Genevese crime family from the late 1960s until the beginning of the 1980s. He succeeded Vito Genovese as boss in 1969 and was succeeded by Vincent Gigante in 1981. He began his career as a soldier on Michael Trigger, Mike Coppola's powerful 116th Street crew in the East Harlem section of New York. During the 1940s, Lombardo served a brief prison stretch for narcotics trafficking, his only imprisonment. Due to his thick eyeglasses, he earned the nickname Benny Squint. In 1959, family boss Vito Genovese was sent to prison. However, Genevese used a series of acting bosses to maintain control of the family from prison. His 3 acting bosses, or ruling panel, were Capo Michel Miranda, underboss Gerardo Jerry Catena, and acting boss Thomas Tommy Ryan Eboli. The trio panel was known to authorities, but in 1962, former mobster turned government witness Joseph Valachi stated before a U.S. Senate subcommittee that Lombardo was also a part of this same panel. In that same year, Anthony Strollo disappeared and was presumed murdered. Strollo's role as a front or acting boss was given to Thomas Eboli. Eboli himself was later gunned down in 1972. It had been theorized that Commission Chairman Carlo Gambino had orchestrated Eboli's murder in order to install his own candidate for Genovese boss in the form of Funzi Tieri, who would replace Eboli as front boss shortly after Eboli's murder. However, according to FBI informant Vincent Caffaro, Lombardo had been boss since 1969 and had been using Eboli and Tieri as decoys to insulate himself from the FBI. In 1981, Tieri died, and Lombardo stepped down as boss due to poor health, naming Vincent Gigante as his successor, while at the same time making Anthony Fat Tony Salerno the new front boss in order to disguise Gigante's transition into the new boss. This way, the FBI would still not know who was really in charge and would continue to go after the wrong people, which they did, sentencing Salerno to 100 years in prison in 1986 in the Mafia Commission trial. Although Lombardo resided in Englewood, New Jersey, he spent his remaining winters in Hollywood, Florida. He made it clear that Gigante was to become the new boss, and Salerno would continue as the front boss. He was 78 years old and living in Florida when he died on April 29, 1987. In 1972, after the murder of Genevese acting boss Thomas Eboli, Tieri became the boss of the Genevese family. At that time, it was speculated that Gambino crime family boss Carlo Gambino had ordered Eboli's murder because Eboli owed him $4 million. According to this theory, Gambino wanted Tieri to be the boss of the Genevese family. However, most experts now believe that he was merely a front for the family's actual boss, Philip Lombardo. Luigi Angelo Martino, the architect for money laundering for the Genevese family, served directly under him. Funzi was considered a low-profile and diplomatic mobster, a good earner for the family who believed in sharing wealth with his soldiers and captains. He was convicted of armed robbery when he was aged 20, but avoided further indictments until the end of his life. Given that Funzi Tieri was a front boss, it is unknown how much power Lombardo allowed him. However, Tieri did have a reputation as an orderly and smart manager who used violence only as a last resort. In 1980, Frank played a key role in the assassination of Philadelphia crime family boss Angelo Bruno and the opening of Atlantic City, New Jersey to the New York crime families. The state of New Jersey had announced the introduction of legal casino gambling in Atlantic City, and the New York families wanted to open operations there. However, Atlantic City belonged to the Philadelphia family and Bruno wasn't willing to share it. In March 1980, Tieri sent a message to Philadelphia's consigliere, Antonio Caponigro, that the Mafia Commission would support him as boss if he assassinated Bruno. What Caponigro didn't know was that the commission had no intention of sanctioning Bruno's murder. On March 21, 1980, Bruno was murdered in his car on a Philadelphia street. The commission immediately summoned Caponigro to New York for a meeting. 2 weeks later, his body was discovered in New York with $20 bills stuffed in his orifices. However, the New York families did achieve access to Atlantic City. Federal prosecutors eventually charged Tieri with being the head of a crime family that was involved in racketeering, extortion, and illegal gambling. On January 23, 1981, the ailing Tieri, using a wheelchair and an oxygen tank, was convicted of violating the RICO Act. At the sentencing, his lawyers argued for leniency, saying that he was dying. Prosecutors told the judge it was an act, and the judge sent him to prison for 10 years. Anthony Provenzano became one of the most powerful capos in New Jersey, with his connection to Teamsters union leader Jimmy Hoffa. Provenzano served as vice president of the IBT's Union City branch during the 1950s. In that office, Provenzano was able to embezzle money from the union's pension fund, receive kickbacks from construction companies to work on sites, and use his title as a legitimate source of income. He was born on May 7, 1917, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the fourth of 6 children to Sicilian immigrants, Rosario and Josephine Provenzano. At age 15, he quit public school and went to work as a $10 a week helper at the H.P. Welch Trucking Company. 3 years later, he became a driver. Provenzano became employed by Teamsters Local 560 in Union City, New Jersey, as a business agent between 1948 and 1958, as the president between 1958 and May 1966, and as secretary-treasurer between November 24, 1975, and June 1978. Provenzano was a resident of Clifton, New Jersey and Hallandale, Florida. In 1959, Provenzano cited the Fifth Amendment 44 times before a Senate racketeering committee, for which Robert F. Kennedy was counsel. In June 1961, Teamsters Local 560 Secretary-Treasurer Anthony Castellitto traveled to upstate New York to meet with Salvatore Briguglio, a mob-associated loan shark. According to federal government reports, Briguglio and Harold Königsberg murdered Castellitto. Subsequently, in August 1961, Provenzano's brother Sal was appointed to the position of trustee. Formerly occupied by Castellitto, Briguglio was appointed to the position of business agent in September 1961. Provenzano's other brother Nunzio was appointed to the position of business agent in February 1963. On November 15, 1960, Provenzano was indicted in the District of New Jersey for extortion for the demand and receipt of labor peace payoffs from the Dorn Transportation Company between 1952 and 1959. On July 12, 1963, Provenzano was convicted of extortion and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. He served 4.5 years, incarcerated between May 1966 and 1970. Although Provenzano had once been a friend of Teamsters Union Director Jimmy Hoffa, he had since become an enemy after a reported feud when both were in federal prison at United States Penitentiary, Lewisburg in Pennsylvania, in the 1960s. Hoffa planned to regain the leadership of the Union, but was met with opposition from several members of the Mafia. In 1973 and 1974, Hoffa asked Provenzano for his support to regain his former position, but he refused and threatened Hoffa by reportedly saying he would pull out his guts and kidnap his grandchildren. At least 2 of his Union opponents had been murdered, and others who had spoken out against him had been assaulted. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa was to meet Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone at 2 p.m. at the Marcus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a Detroit suburb. Hoffa was never seen again. Giacalone and Provenzano, who denied having scheduled a meeting with Hoffa, were found not to have been near the restaurant that afternoon. While one account cited by Times states that Provenzano was seen fraternizing with local union members in Hoboken, New Jersey, according to the Associated Press. Provenzano told investigators that he was playing cards with Stephen Andretta, Thomas Andretta's brother, in Union City, which borders Hoboken, on the afternoon that Hoffa disappeared. 10 weeks after Hoffa's disappearance, President Richard Nixon made his first public appearance since his resignation, during which he golfed with Frank Fitzsimmons, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and Provenzano. On December 4, 1975, a federal investigator in Detroit said in a court hearing, presided over by James Paul Churchill, that a witness had identified 3 New Jersey men who had participated in the abduction and murder of Hoffa. The 3 men, close associates of Provenzano, were Salvatore Briguglio, his brother Gabriel Briguglio, and Thomas Andretta. Provenzano was indicted in the Southern District of New York, along with Anthony Bentro and Lawrence Palladino, for conspiracy to violate the anti-kickback statute for a proposed $2.3 million pension fund loan from the Utica Teamsters Benefit Fund for the renovation of the Woodstock Hotel. In July 1978, he was convicted of these charges and sentenced to 4 years in prison. On June 23, 1976, Provenzano was indicted in Ulster County, New York, along with Briguglio and Königsberg, on charges of conspiracy and murder in connection to the death of Anthony Castellito. On June 14, 1978, Provenzano was convicted of murder, while the conspiracy to commit murder count was dismissed, and was sentenced to life imprisonment in Kingston, New York, exactly 1 week later. In February of 1979, Provenzano was indicted in the District of New Jersey, along with Gabriel Briguglio, Stephen and Thomas Andretta, and Ralph Pilecchia on RICO charges in the C-Train Labor Peace Payoffs case. On May 25, 1979, he was convicted of these charges, and on July 10, 1979, he was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. In the early 1980s, Vincent the Chin Gigante became the Genevese family's new boss and promoted powerful New Jersey mobster Louis Bobby Manna to consigliere. Manna would oversee the New Jersey factions with help from his top aide Lawrence Dendico. Manna rented an apartment in Greenwich Village, New York to be close to Gigante's headquarters at the Triangle Social Club. However, Manna's power base was in New Jersey. He is the brother-in-law of Genevese crime family mob associate Gerald Durazzo. He supervised 4 capo regimes while also serving as consigliere. He ran his personal criminal operations out of an Italian eatery called Casella's at 615 First Street in Hoboken, New Jersey. Manna became the lead man for the Genovese family in discussions with the Gambino crime family on how to equitably divide up that area. In 1987, Manna began pushing the Genovese family to murder John Gotti, the new boss of the Gambino family, a Gambino capo. Gotti had arranged the murder of Gambino boss Paul Castellano in 1985 and taken control of the Gambino family without the approval of the commission. Manna was especially unhappy about Gotti's unsanctioned coup against Castellano. In addition, Gotti wanted to take the lucrative South Jersey holdings that used to belong to the Philadelphia crime family and leave the less desirable North Jersey territory to the Genovese family. Between August 1987 and January 1988, the Federal Bureau of Investigation recorded 12 conversations in which Manna and other Genovese mobsters discussed murdering John Gotti, Gene Gotti, and New York contractor Irwin Schiff. While discussing the John Gotti murder, Manna advised the hitman to wear a disguise as the target area was fairly open. On August 8, 1987, Schiff was shot in the head while dining in a Manhattan restaurant. Manna was later indicted, and on June 26, 1989, Manna was convicted of conspiring to murder John Gotti, Gene Gotti, and Irwin Schiff in aid of racketeering. On September 26, 1989, Judge Mary Ann Trump Barry sentenced Manna to 80 years in federal prison. It was revealed by the FBI in 2004 that prior to Manna's sentencing, he was involved in a murder plot of Judge Mary Ann Trump Barry, the United States Attorney Samuel Alito, and Chief Prosecutor Michael Chertoff. In December 2020, the 91-year-old man requested compassionate release, but was denied. He was denied release again in November 2021. In the mid-1970s, Tino the Greek Fiumara began representing many of the Genevese family's interests on the New Jersey waterfront. After years of working under capo regime Peter Lepke, Fiumara worked closely with Genevese family street boss Frank Funzi Tieri, who controlled all of the family's northern New Jersey waterfront rackets. He also maintained a working relationship with Genovese Jersey captain Anthony Axaturo. Fiumara gained control of the ILA by paying off Thomas Buzanka, the president of ILA local members in Brooklyn and New Jersey. The connection to Buzanka allowed Fiumara to control Anthony Scotto, the ILA boss of Brooklyn docks. Fiumara's power continued to grow on New Jersey waterfront with the help of Michael Coppola, Michael Borelli, and Joseph Dotto Jr. By the mid-1970s, his crew controlled many of the Genevese union and labor rackets on the New Jersey waterfront. Fiumara's crew also cooperated in illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and narcotics rackets with Lucchese crime family captain Anthony Axaturo. One of his biggest rivals was Genevese crime mobster John DiGilio, a powerful figure on the Bayonne waterfront, and one of his strongest allies in New Jersey was Genevese mobster Lawrence Dentico. During the 1950s, Dentico worked for boss Vito Genevese. In 1957, authorities suspected that Dentico provided the murder weapon and getaway car in the shooting death of mobster Johnny Earl. In 1966, Dentico was arrested for loan sharking and extortion rackets in Hoboken, New Jersey. When Vincent the Chin Gigante became family boss in 1981, Dentico was working as a top aide in New Jersey to Luis Mana, the former consigliere. In 1981, Dentico was convicted of fraud and conspiracy involving the bribing of officials in Union City, New Jersey, to rig bids on public construction contracts, and served a 6-year prison sentence. After Gigante went to prison for racketeering in 1997, Dentico and Genovese mobster Frank Iliano formed a two-man ruling panel of street bosses to operate the family. In August 2005, Dentico and other Genevese mobsters were indicted on charges of extortion, conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit murder. The defendants were accused of participating in loan sharking, sports bookmaking, numbers running, and football ticket gambling. He pleaded guilty, and on August 16, 2006, was sentenced to 51 months in prison. On May 12, 2009, he was released from prison. However, in 1979, Tino Fiumara was convicted of labor racketeering and federal extortion in Newark and Manhattan, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. While in prison, he continued to control the New Jersey crew. Different Fiumara crew members, such as Genevese soldier Michael Mikey Cigars Coppola, assisted Fiumara in running the day-to-day operations, while Fiumara gave orders through messengers and underlings who frequently visited him in prison. In February 1994, he was released from prison and quickly assumed control of the New Jersey faction. Fiumara's old rival, John DiGilio, was murdered by the Genevese family in 1988, the previous head of the New Jersey faction, consigliere. Louis Bobby Mana was imprisoned in 1989 for conspiracy to murder Gambino crime family boss John Gotti. Anthony Axaturo had been demoted by his boss and was in hiding. Tino was now completely in charge. By the mid-1990s, Tino Fiumara was recognized as a mafia powerhouse in New Jersey. In 1996, Coppola became a fugitive to avoid prosecution for a 1977 New Jersey murder. Fiumara and Coppola continued to communicate throughout the later part of the 1990s, as Coppola still played an active role in the leadership of the Fiumara crew. Coppola's reputation and close association with Fiumara allowed him to continue making money while in hiding. In April 1999, Fiumara was returned to prison on a parole violation. To meet with Genevese superiors and associates in New York City, Fiumara had been driven to the meetings hiding in car trunks. Fiumara was to be released in 2002. However, in 2003, Fiumara received another 8-month parole violation. Fiumara had been in contact with Coppola, still a fugitive, and failed to report the contact to law enforcement. On November 30, 2005, the body of Genevese mobster Lawrence Richie was found in a car trunk in New Jersey. It was rumored that Fiumara approved Richie's murder because he had refused to plead guilty in an ongoing racketeering trial. In 2009, the New York Times reported that former New Jersey federal prosecutor and New Jersey gubernatorial candidate Chris Christie was a step-nephew to Fiumara's older brother. Christie told the Times that he first learned about Fiumara at age 15 from a newspaper article. Christie said he met Fiumara once at a family gathering and another time at a Texas prison. Long before becoming a federal prosecutor in 2002, on November 3, 2009, Chris Christie was elected governor. As a known associate and supporter of longtime Genevese crime family boss Vincent Gigante, Fiumara had played an important role within the Genevese crime family's New Jersey faction for more than 30 years. For 15 years, Fiumara had been recognized as the head of the New Jersey rackets for the Genevese crime family, and in the last several years he was seen as a future candidate for boss of the Genevese family. Up until his death, Fiumara was involved in New Jersey rackets and was a power within the family.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Lepke Buchalter was born to a Russian Jewish family in the Lower East Side neighborhood of Manhattan on February 6, 1897. His mother, Rose Buchalter, called him Lepkele, Little Louis in Yiddish, which later became Lepke. Louis Buchalter had one sister and three brothers. One brother eventually became a dentist, another brother a college professor and rabbi, and the third brother a pharmacist. His father, Barnett Buchalter, was a Russian immigrant who operated a hardware store on the Lower East Side. In 1909, when Lepke was 12, his father died. In 1910, he finished elementary school and started a job selling theatrical goods. Reportedly, on the Lower East Side, he attended the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, where he was an honor roll student. Soon after, his mother moved to Arizona for health reasons, leaving Buchalter in the care of his sister Sarah. However, Lepke was beyond her control. He was arrested in New York for the first time for burglary and assault, but the case was discharged. In late 1915 or early 1916, he went to live with his uncle in Bridgeport, Connecticut. On February 29, 1916, Lepke was arrested in Bridgeport on burglary charges and was sent to the Cheshire Reformatory for juvenile offenders in Cheshire, Connecticut, until July 12, 1917. After a dispute with his uncle over wages, he moved back to New York City. On September 28, 1917, he was sentenced in New York to 18 months in state prison at Sing Sing in Ossining, New York, on a grand larceny conviction. After a transfer to Auburn Prison in Auburn, New York, Buchalter was released on January 27, 1919. On January 22, 1920, Buchalter returned to Sing Sing on a 30-month sentence for attempted burglary. He was released on March 16, 1922. Upon his 1922 release from prison, he started working with his childhood friend, mobster Jacob Gura Shapiro. Through force and fear, they began gaining control of the garment industry unions. He then used the unions to threaten strikes and demand weekly payments from factory owners while dipping into union bank accounts. His control of the unions evolved into a protection racket, extending into areas such as bakery trucking. The unions were profitable for him, and he kept a hold over them even after becoming an important figure in organized crime. Buchalter later formed an alliance with Tommy Lucchese, a leader of the Lucchese crime family, and together they controlled the garment district. Him and Shapiro moved into new and fashionable luxury buildings on Eastern Parkway with family who were active synagogue goers, Union Temple and Kol Israel Synagogue of Brooklyn. In later years, Lepke and his family lived in a penthouse in the exclusive Central Park West section of Manhattan. In 1927, Lepke and Shapiro were arrested for the murder of Jacob Organ Little Augie and the attempted murder of Irish-American bootlegger Jack Diamond, a criminal rival. However, the charges were later dropped due to a lack of evidence. Buchalter was described as a quiet man who for years managed to avoid the public spotlight. In conversations with his criminal associates, Lepke preferred listening over talking. He generously compensated his gang members and took them to hockey games, boxing matches, and even winter cruises. In the early 1930s, Buchalter created an effective process for performing contract killings for the mob. It had no name, but the press 10 years later called it Murder Incorporated. The mobsters wanted to insulate themselves from any connection to these murders. His partner, mobster Albert Anastasia, would relay a contract request from the mob to Buchalter. In turn, he would assign the job to Jewish and Italian street gang members from Brooklyn. None of these contract killers had any connections with the major crime families. If they were caught, they could not implicate their mafia connections in the crimes. He used the same killers for his own murder contracts. The Murder Inc. killers were soon completing jobs all over the country for their mobster bosses. In 1935, he arranged his most significant murder, the powerful New York gangster Dutch Schultz. Schultz had proposed to the National Crime Syndicate, a confederation of mobsters, that New York District Attorney Thomas Dewey be murdered. Co-founder of the syndicate and leading mafioso Charles Lucky Luciano argued that a Dewey assassination would precipitate a massive law enforcement crackdown. An enraged Schultz said he would kill Dewey anyway and walked out of the meeting. After 6 hours of deliberations, the commission ordered Lepke to eliminate Schultz. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was shot in a Newark, New Jersey tavern and succumbed to his injuries the following day. In 1941, Buchalter killer Charles the Bug Workman was charged in the Schultz murder. In 1935, law enforcement estimated that him and Shapiro had 250 men working for them, and that Buchalter was grossing over $1 million per year. They controlled rackets in the trucking, baking, and garment industries throughout New York. Lepke also owned the Rio Bamba, a posh nightclub in Manhattan. On September 13, 1936, Murder Inc. killers, acting on Buchalter's orders, gunned down Joseph Rosen, a Brooklyn candy store owner. Rosen was a former garment industry trucker whose union Buchalter took over. Rosen had angered Lepke by refusing to leave town as Buchalter demanded when, despite the absence of proof. Buchalter believed Rosen was cooperating with District Attorney Thomas Dewey. At the time, no one was indicted in the Rosen murder. On November 8, 1936, Buchalter and Shapiro were convicted of violating federal antitrust laws in the rabbit fur industry in New York. While out on bail, both Buchalter and Shapiro disappeared. On November 13th, both men were sentenced in absentia to 2 years in federal prison. The two men later appealed the verdict, but in June 1937 both convictions were upheld. On May 9, 1941, Lepke was arraigned in New York State Court on the 1936 Rosen murder, along with 3 other murders. His order for the Rosen hit had been overheard by mobster Abe Rilles, who turned state's evidence in 1940 and implicated Buchalter in 4 murders, returned from Leavenworth to Brooklyn to stand trial for the Rosen slaying. Buchalter's position was worsened by the testimony of Albert Tic-Toc Tannenbaum. 4 hours into deliberation, at 2 a.m. on November 30, 1941, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. On December 2, 1941, Lepke was sentenced to death along with his lieutenants Emmanuel Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone. Buchalter's lawyers immediately filed an appeal. In October 1942, the New York Court of Appeals voted 4-3 to uphold his conviction and death sentence. 2 dissenting judges thought the evidence was so weak that errors in the jury instructions as to how to evaluate certain testimony were harmful enough to require a new trial. The 3rd dissenter agreed, but added that, in his opinion, there was insufficient evidence to sustain a guilty verdict, so the indictment should be dismissed altogether. Failure of proof means no retrial. Buchalter's lawyers then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court granted the mobster a petition to review the case. In 1943, The court affirmed the conviction 7-0, with 2 justices abstaining. His appeals were now exhausted. When the U.S. Supreme Court confirmed Buchalter's conviction, he was serving his racketeering sentence at Leavenworth Federal Prison. New York State authorities demanded that the federal government turn over Buchalter for execution. On January 21, 1944, after many delays and much controversy, federal agents finally turned him over to state authorities, who immediately transported him to Sing Sing prison. He made several pleas for mercy, but they were rejected. On March 4, 1944, Louis Buchalter was executed in the electric chair in Sing Sing. He had no final words. A few minutes before his execution, his lieutenants Weiss and Capone were also executed. Harry Mayione and Frank Abbandando were the first members of the Brooklyn combination to be put on trial for murder. In May 1940, the trial started for the May 25, 1937 ice pick murder of George Whitey Rudnick in a Brooklyn parking garage. Harry Strauss was also indicted for the murder, and after initially agreeing to cooperate with the district attorney's office, he was severed from the trial. On May 15, 1940, Abe Relis testified that Rudnick was marked for death after Strauss claimed he had obtained information that Rudnick was a stool pigeon for the police. Kid Twist also testified that he waited outside the garage while Mayione, Abbandando, and Strauss were inside with Rudnick. After Rudnick was believed to have been murdered, Abbandando called for Relis and summoned Angelo Giuli Catalano to the garage to assist with moving the body. Since Rudnick was still alive, Strauss resumed his assault with an ice pick, and Harry used a meat cleaver to complete the murder. The next day, Catalano, who drove the automobile with Rudnick's body, corroborated Relis's account of the murder. Dookie Maffatore and Abe Pretty Levine testified that they stole the automobile that was used to dispose of the body. Mayione and 14 witnesses testified that he was at his grandmother's wake when Rudnick was murdered. The funeral home undertaker and embalmer testified that Mayione was not at the wake. Also, one of Mayonne's chief witnesses admitted that he committed perjury as ordered by Mayonne's brother, whom he feared. On May 23, 1940, Mayione and Abbandando were convicted of first-degree murder, which meant a mandatory sentence of death in the electric chair. New York's highest court, the Court of Appeals, overturned the conviction on a 4-3 vote in December 1940. The second trial started on March 10, 1941. At one point during the trial, Mayione lost his temper and threw a glass of water at Relis. Mayione and Abbandando were convicted of first-degree murder for a second time on April 3, 1941. Mayione and Abbandando were formally sentenced to death for a second time on April 14, 1941. The Court of Appeals upheld the second conviction on January 8, 1942. Mayione and Abbandando were executed at Sing Sing prison on February 19, 1942. Harry Strauss and Martin Goldstein were put on trial for the September 4, 1939, strangulation murder of bookmaker Irving Feinstein, whose body was set on fire and left in a vacant lot after Feinstein had been strangled. The trial started in September 1940, with Strauss feigning insanity. Abe Relis, the chief prosecution witness, testified that Feinstein was murdered on orders of Albert Anastasia, since he supposedly crossed Vincent Mangano. Relis testified that he, Goldstein, and Strauss murdered Feinstein in his house. Relis's mother-in-law also testified that Relis and Strauss had asked her for an ice pick and clothesline earlier in the day and, while at the house, heard loud music masking a commotion in the living room. She also testified hearing Strauss say that he had been bitten. Goldstein's former bodyguard driver Seymour Magoon corroborated the story, as he testified that on the night of the murder, Goldstein told him that he, along with Relis and Strauss, had murdered Puggy Feinstein, and that shortly after the crime was committed, Goldstein and Duke Maffatore burned the body. Goldstein's attorney decided not to put up a defense. Strauss's attorney claimed his client was insane. Strauss was briefly allowed on the witness stand but refused to take his oath and was babbling incoherently as he was led back to the defense table. Strauss then began chewing on a leather strap of a briefcase. On September 19, 1940, Strauss and Goldstein were convicted of first-degree murder and a week later sentenced to death in the electric chair. On April 24, 1941, Strauss and Goldstein's convictions were affirmed by New York's Court of Appeals on a 4-3 decision. Strauss and Goldstein were executed in the electric chair on June 12, 1941. Irving Nitzberg, who was imported by the Brooklyn Combination from the Bronx, was put on trial for the January 9, 1939, murder of Albert Schumann in Brooklyn based on the testimony of 3 accomplices, Abe Rillis, Albert Tannenbaum, and Seymour Magoon. Abe Rillis testified that Schumann was killed since he cooperated with the authorities, who were conducting an inquiry of Lepke's involvement in labor racketeering. Kid Twist also testified that he helped plan the murder of Schumann with Lepke, who was a fugitive at the time, and Mendy Weiss and that Lepke received approval from Albert Anastasia to use a person who lived outside Brooklyn to help with completing the assignment. Seymour Magoon testified that he stole the car used in the murder on Abe's orders. Albert Tannenbaum testified that he was the driver that picked up Nitzberg and Schumann under the pretense of performing a robbery. Nitzberg, who was in the back seat, shot Schumann twice in the back of the head when Tannenbaum gave a predetermined signal. Tannenbaum and Nitzberg then exited the murder car to join Rillis and another gangster in the getaway car and departed from the crime scene. Nitzberg was convicted of first-degree murder on May 23, 1941, and sentenced to death in the electric chair. However, on December 10, 1941, the conviction was overturned on a 4-3 vote by New York's Court of Appeals, which questioned the use of testimony of non-accomplice witnesses who were promised leniency to support the testimony of Rillis, Tannenbaum, and Magoon. Nitzberg was tried a second time in 1942, with the now-deceased Rillis's testimony read to the jury. Nitzberg was convicted for a second time on March 12, 1942. The conviction was overturned again by the Court of Appeals on a 4-3 vote, but, this time, the court also dismissed the indictment as faulty, since the only testimony presented to the grand jury was from accomplices without corroboration. Vito Sacco Guarino was sought for questioning in the Brooklyn murder investigation as the member assigned to eliminate witnesses against the combination. First, Guarino attempted to silence a small-time gangster and eyewitness to the George Rudnick murder. Police picked up Angelo Giulio Catalano on the streets of Brooklyn shortly after he was bailed out by the syndicate, as Guarino tried to convince him to hide out on Long Island. Several days later, Guarino used a contact, corrupt Queens County Deputy Sheriff William Caselli, to enter the county's civil prison on the night of March 29, 1940. Caselli then forced Joseph Joe the Baker Liberto, who was being held as a material witness in the George Rudnick murder, to meet with Guarino. According to Liberto, he was pushed up against a wall in his cell and threatened with death if he cooperated with the district attorney. Liberto was taken into custody shortly after an acquaintance drove him to a farmhouse on Long Island. Liberto quickly exited through a window, convinced he was going to be killed. Guarino, who was hiding out in New Jersey for much of 1940, was arrested on September 12, 1940, at the Church of the Guardian Angel in Manhattan, screaming hysterically in fear for his life. Shortly after being arrested, Guarino confessed to 3 syndicate murders and implicated himself in 4 others. In March 1942, Guarino pleaded guilty to 3 murders. In April 1942, Guarino was sentenced to 80 years to life in prison. He died of a heart ailment on April 22, 1957, at Dannemora Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Jacob Drucker and Irving Cohen were put on trial separately for the murder of racketeer Walter Sage in the Catskills. Sage was killed with an ice pick and had the frame of a slot machine tied to his body, which was found in Swan Lake on July 31, 1937. After the Sage murder, believing he was also going to be killed, Cohen fled to California and managed to secure small roles in films. He was identified 2 years later by the chief prosecution witness, Abraham Levine, who spotted Cohen in one of the ringside crowd scenes in the 1939 film Golden Boy. According to Levine, Sage was riding in a car with Cohen and Drucker when he was stabbed 32 times with an ice pick, as Levine and Harry Strauss were following in another car. During the assault and struggle, Drucker stabbed Cohen once in the arm, as Sage had grabbed the steering wheel and wrecked the car. Levine also testified that he observed Drucker wiping the ice pick clean before helping dispose of the body. Cohen testified in his own defense, stating that Levine had stabbed him with an ice pick as he was walking home from a casino. Cohen stated that he was assaulted by Levine, another man on Drucker's orders, since he refused to pay 25% profit on a game of chance that he operated. Cohen was acquitted on June 21, 1940. Drucker, who was a suspect in 4 murders in the Catskills, was a fugitive for over 3 years, until the FBI located him in Delaware. Drucker was convicted of second-degree murder on May 5, 1944, and received a sentence of 25 years to life. Drucker died in Attica prison in January 1962. Jack the Dandy Parisi was acquitted of 2 murders: Teamsters official Morris Diamond in Brooklyn and music publishing executive Irving Penn in the Bronx. Penn was killed by mistaken identity, as the intended target, Philip Orlovsky, a Cutters Union official, left his home early to get a shave the day his killers waited for him. Parisi was a fugitive for 10 years, until he was captured in Pennsylvania in 1949. Albert Tannenbaum was brought in from Atlanta, where he was reportedly living, to testify for the prosecution. One accomplice in the Penn murder, Jacob Cuppy Migden, who provided the erroneous identification of Penn, and who was also a fugitive for several years, pleaded guilty to attempted first-degree assault in the middle of his murder trial, and was sentenced to a term of 5 to 10 years. Each of Parisi's murder trials ended with an acquittal, as the judges directed a verdict of not guilty due to the lack of corroborating evidence, since the chief witnesses for the prosecution were accomplices. He died at home of natural causes on December 27, 1982, at the age of 83. Max the Jerk Golob was indicted with Frank Abbandando for first-degree murder in the slaying of gangster John Spider Murtha on March 3, 1935. With little evidence other than the eyewitness testimony of Murtha's female companion, Golob was permitted to plead guilty to second-degree assault and received a maximum term of 5 years. Sidney Fats Brown was the subject of a sealed first-degree murder indictment in Sullivan County, New York. The indictment was dismissed after the death of Abe Relis, the sole witness. Brown was never arrested, and the identity of the murder victim was never revealed. Murder, Inc. was believed to be responsible for between 400 and 1,000 contract killings, until the group was exposed in 1941 by former member Abe Kid Twist Relis. In the trials that followed, many members were convicted and executed, and Abe Relis himself died after suspiciously falling from a window. Thomas E. Dewey first came to prominence as a prosecutor of Murder, Inc. and other organized crime cases, before being elected to become the 47th governor of New York. The Bugs and Meyer Mob was the predecessor to Murder, Incorporated. The gang was founded by New York Jewish mobsters Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel in the early 1920s. Sicilian mafioso Charles Lucky Luciano created the commission and began to closely cooperate with his friend Lansky and the Jewish mob in general, establishing a multi-ethnic alliance that eventually was deemed the National Crime Syndicate. Soon after, Siegel and Lansky disbanded the Bugs and Meyer gang and helped form Murder, Incorporated.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Alphonse Indelicato was born in New York City. His family came from Sayacca, Italy. They became naturalized citizens when living in Utica, New York. Indelicato was the father-in-law of Bonanno associate Salvatore Valenti and ex-son-in-law of Bonanno captain and bookmaker Charles Ruvolo. Indelicato was particularly fond of a pair of custom-made red leather cowboy boots, which may have been the source of his nickname, Sonny Red. Sonny is a nephew to Salvatore Falcone, a heroin trafficker. Indelicato was married first to Charles Ruvolo's unidentified daughter, with whom he fathered a son, Anthony Bruno Indelicato. Sonny later married Margaret Elizabeth McFadden, but the two later became estranged. Indelicato was indicted in 1972 for the inquiry into the murder of Joe Gallo, but was released on $15,000 bail. Joseph Massino began jockeying for power with Dominic Sonny Black Napolitano, another Philip Rastelli loyalist capo, after the 1979 murder of Carmine Galante. Both men were themselves threatened by another faction, seeking to depose the absentee boss led by Captains Sonny Red, Dominic Trinchera, and Philip Giacone. The commission initially tried to maintain neutrality, but in 1981, Massino got word from his informants that the three capos were stocking up on automatic weapons and planning to kill the Rastelli loyalists within the Bonanno family to take complete control. Massino turned to Colombo crime family boss Carmine Persico and Gambino crime family boss Paul Castellano for advice. They told him to act immediately. On May 5, 1981, Massino loyalists shot and killed Indelicato, Trinchera, and Giacone in a Brooklyn nightclub. On the pretext of working out a peace agreement, Massino had invited them to meet with him at the 2020 nightclub in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. However, Massino's real plan was to assassinate the three captains. The ambush was set in the club storeroom, with Salvatore Vitali and three other gunmen wearing ski masks hiding in a closet. One of the gunmen was mobster Vito Rizzuto, who came from Montreal with another Canadian mobster to help Massino. Massino told the men to avoid shooting wildly so that bullets wouldn't spray around the room. Massino also brought drop cloths and ropes for disposing of the bodies afterwards. When the capos arrived at the club, Massino and Bonanno mobster Gerlando Sciascia and Frank Lino escorted them to the storeroom. As the men entered the room, Sciascia brushed his hand through his hair, giving the prearranged signal. Vitali and gunmen rushed out of the closet, with Rizzuto yelling, "It's a holdup." Massino immediately punched Giacone, knocking him to the floor, and also stopping Indelicato from escaping. Giacone got up and tried to run out of the room, but was blocked up against a wall with Trinchera. The gunmen killed Giacone with a volley of submachine gun fire. They then turned their weapons on Indelicato and Trinchera. The three capos were unarmed, as was the rule when attending a peace meeting. After the killings, the Bonanno gunmen transported the three bodies to a lot in Lindenwood, Queens, in an area known as the Hole. The lot was a Gambino mob graveyard. Gambino capo John Gotti arranged for his men to bury the bodies there as a favor to Massino. A few weeks later, on May 28, authorities discovered Indelicato's body and removed it from the lot. In October 2004, after some children reported finding a body in the Lindenwood lot, FBI agents excavated the property and discovered the bodies of Trinchera and Giacone. Among the personal items they unearthed was a Piaget watch that had belonged to Giacone's wife. In December 2004, the bodies were positively identified as Giacone and Trinchera. On June 23, 2005, Massino, then a government witness to avoid the death penalty, pleaded guilty to several murders including those of Giacone, Trinchera, and Indelicato. He received 2 life sentences in prison. On May 4, 2007, after being extradited to the United States, Rizzuto pleaded guilty in a Brooklyn court to reduce charges in the murder of 3 capos and was sentenced to 10 years in state prison. After his father's murder, Indelicato's son Anthony went into hiding in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Massino wanted to kill him also, but he had missed the meeting. His father brought Lino instead, who was the sole survivor of the massacre. Lino, who had escaped, was quickly won over to Massino's side. Napolitano assigned associate Donnie Brasco, who he hoped to make a made man to kill Indelicato. Brasco, however, was in fact an undercover FBI agent named Joseph Pistone. Shortly after the hit was ordered, Pistone's assignment was ended and Napolitano was informed of their infiltration. Joseph Joe Glitz Galitzia was a New York mobster who became a high-ranking soldier in the Genevese crime family and ran a large gasoline bootlegging operation. In the mid-1970s, Galitzia became a made man in the Genevese family by killing Genevese mobster Carlo Colli Di Pietro. Di Pietro had been a partner of both Galitzia and future Gambino boss John Gotti in a Queens flea market. During this time, Joe and Larry Galitzia earned a reputation as huge moneymakers by moving his family into the extremely lucrative gasoline bootlegging rackets, while never attaining a position within the administration. He became a very influential and wealthy mafioso who occasionally answered directly to Vincent Gigante and his uppermost family members, often going over his captain's head. Joe maintained interest in several Queens and Long Island produce companies as well. Joe and his brother Larry ran construction schemes, loan sharking, and extortion rackets in Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Long Island. In the early 1980s, Larry went to federal prison for supervising a credit card fraud scheme. The Galizias also engaged in criminal activities with Genevese gangsters Rosario Gungi, Alphonse Ali Shades Malangone, and Rudolph Rudy Kubol Izzy. The gasoline bootlegging rackets were originally conceived by Russian mobsters. However, the Russians needed the cooperation of the New York Mafia Five families to continue their business. Galizia's operation was run by Russian mob boss Marat Balagula and his associates Igor Roizman, Igor Porotsky, and Sheldon Levine. The mobsters would set up shell companies to distribute gasoline at a price fraudulently represented as including federal, state, and local excise taxes. Naturally, the mobsters would in fact pay no tax on such sales. Should the operation be uncovered by the authorities, the shell companies would simply be closed and others opened. Another major figure in the gasoline racket scene was Colombo crime family capo Michael Franzese, a friend of Galitzia. In 1986, the Galizias, their Russian partners in Franzese, were charged with evading over $5 million in taxes in just a few months. All the defendants were eventually convicted or pleaded guilty, and all went to federal prison. In 1989, while in prison, Joe Galitzia was suspected by federal investigators of ordering the murder of Michael Markowitz, a Russian gangster. Markowitz was shot dead in Brooklyn by Joseph Reich. Galitzia would be indicted again on similar charges in 1991. An investigation by the New York State Governor's Office reported that the New York Five Families bootlegging scheme avoided taxes on 1 out of every 10 gallons of gasoline brought into the metropolitan area. The report stated that gasoline bootlegging had become the mob's most profitable scheme. Being one of the Genevese family's first point men in the gasoline bootlegging racket, Galitzia was involved in the setting up of a council of mobsters that decided which wise guys and families had the rights to which companies. Profits. Other wise guys involved in the operation included Genovese soldier Daniel Danny Pagano, based in the Bronx and East Harlem, Gambino Captain Anthony Fat Tony Morelli, based in Staten Island, Gambino soldier Gennaro Jimmy, Sweats Della Monica Morelli's Staten Island crew, Lucchese family underboss Anthony Gaspite Casso, who testified before Congress about the mob's involvement with the Russians, Colombo Capo Victor Orena Jr., son of the family's former acting boss, Colombo soldiers Frank Frankie the Bug Shortino and Joseph Odino, both Orena crew members. Joseph Galitzia's brother Lawrence, Larry Glitz.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Isidore Blumenfeld, commonly known as Kid Can, was a Romanian-born Jewish-American organized crime enforcer based in Minneapolis, Minnesota for over 4 decades. He remains the most notorious mobster in the history of Minnesota. He was associated with several high-profile crimes in the city's history. He was tried and acquitted for the 1924 murder of cab driver Charles Goldberg. Blumenfeld was also present at the scene of the attempted murder by Vern Miller of Minneapolis Police Department officer James Trepanier. Blumenfeld was also tried and acquitted for personally firing the murder weapon, a Thompson submachine gun, in the globally infamous December 1935 contract killing of Twin Cities investigative journalist Walter Liggett. He was also unsuccessfully prosecuted in federal court for both conspiracy and racketeering in the mobbed-up hostile takeover and dismantling of the Twin City rapid transit streetcar system during the early 1950s. Blumenfeld was convicted of violating the Federal Mann Act in 1959 and of attempted jury tampering in 1961. After a short prison term, Blumenfeld retired to Miami Beach, Florida, where he and Meyer Lansky operated a real estate empire. He remained involved in organized crime until his death, and left behind an estimated $10 million fortune. With the onset of Prohibition, Kid Can and his brothers Harry Bloom and Jacob Blumenfeld, alias Dandy and Yiddy Bloom, were transformed from small-time hoods into major organized crime figures in association with the American Mafia. By his 20s, Blumenfeld and his brothers held considerable power over criminal activities in Minneapolis, and oversaw bootlegging, illegal gambling, prostitution, extortion, and labor racketeering. Neil Carlin has described their organization as led by the Kid on machine gun and Harry and Yiddy Bloom on brains. Their ties to the Chicago outfit and New York City's Genevese crime family date back to the Prohibition period. According to a later trial, they would legally import industrial-grade alcohol from Samuel Bronfman's distillery in Montreal, which was shipped across the Great Lakes to Duluth, and then driven on souped-up Ford automobiles to the A La Pompadour perfume factory in the Twin Cities. The brothers also ran illegal distilleries in the forests near Fort Snelling. According to historian Elaine Davis, Kid Can and his brothers, like many other organized crime figures from the Twin Cities, Chicago and Kansas City, made frequent trips to Stearns and Morrison counties to purchase Minnesota 13, a very high-quality moonshine distilled locally by Polish and German-American farmers, with the collusion of local politicians and law. Davis writes that the main go-between connecting local moonshiners with organized crime was Melrose resident Chick Molitor, who lived with his family on a dairy farm near Big Birch Lake. The Blumenfelds, with whom Molitor had a very close business relationship, visited the area so often that they allegedly owned property south of the Rock Tavern in Melrose. According to Twin Cities crime reporter Paul Maccabee, Kid Can's rivalry with Minneapolis's Irish mob ended after he and Irish mob bosses Big Ed Morgan and Tommy Banks divided the city with a handshake. Number of deaths are attributed to Blumenfeld and his gang, including journalists who were killed after writing articles exposing the inner workings of his organization, as well as his ties to corrupt politicians from several parties. A Jewish restaurant owner who recalls this era once said that the Blumenfelds were worshipped by several generations of neighborhood boys. There was a high degree of political and civil corruption in the region in the 1920s and 1930s. The mainstream newspapers hardly mentioned what was going on, as any outlet that published articles critical of the status quo was threatened. Some small tabloid newspapers attempted to report what was going on, but reporters and editors quickly became targets. Howard Guilford of the Twin City Reporter was shot and killed on September 6, 1934. Sports journalist Sid Hartman, who grew up in a poor Russian Jewish family in North Minneapolis, was an 11-year-old newspaper peddler when he was brought by Minneapolis Tribune Street circulation manager Joseph Katzman into the upper room at Jack Doyle's restaurant on Hennepin Avenue between 4th and 5th Streets. At the time, the restaurant was downstairs, and upstairs was one of the largest sports betting operations in Minneapolis. Kid Can, Tommy Banks, and the Berman brothers were regular visitors, and Hartman's decades-long friendship with them began during those years. From their headquarters at the Flame Jazz Club in Minneapolis's Washington Avenue Gateway District, the AZ Syndicate also committed many other crimes. According to Hartman, Kid Can would bring in Sophie Tucker, Cab Calloway, entertainers like that, to appear at his club. Then, after hours, they would close the doors and the real show would begin. One time, the cops came barging in at 4 a.m., took us all out, and put everyone in the paddy wagon. If they had booked me with the rest of the people, I probably would have made the newspaper and lost my job at the Tribune. I did some begging, and the cops let me go. On August 23, 1933, a federal grand jury in Oklahoma City indicted Blumenfeld for money laundering. The $200,000 ransom machine gun Kelly had received following the kidnapping of oil man Charles F. Urschel had been traced to Hennepin State Bank in Minneapolis. Blumenfeld was arrested and transported to Oklahoma City to await his trial. Minneapolis Police Chief Joseph Lemire traveled down to Oklahoma City to testify in favor of Kid Can, and the charges were dropped. In December 1933, the AZ Syndicate's accountant, Conrad Althen, would become a secret informant for the Internal Revenue Service, and whom, according to Paul Maccabee, knew where every penny and body was buried, was thrown out of a car into a Dakota County cornfield and shot to death with a Thompson submachine gun. Following the end of Prohibition, Blumenfeld and his family continued to maintain control over the now legal liquor industry and owned all the big liquor stores, East Hennepin, Loring Liquors, and Lake Street. They monopolized the liquor business, and that's why they had so many enemies. According to an internal FBI memo, it is impossible to operate any place in Minneapolis without first getting permission from the syndicate, and the place is operated without obtaining such permission. The syndicate sees to it that the new place is immediately closed. The most notorious murder was that of Walter Liggett, one of the founders of the Farmer Labor Party and the editor of a weekly newspaper called the Midwest American. As part of what was termed the Liggett-Townley Revolt against Farmer Labor Party leader and Minnesota Governor Floyd Olson, Liggett began reporting on links he found between Twin Cities Irish and Jewish organized crime and senior politicians from the Farmer Labor Party. Beginning on June 29, 1935, every issue of the Midwest American printed 10 reasons for impeaching Governor Olson, including political corruption and collusion with organized crime. Throughout September 1935, Liggett reported on a wet councilmanic ring which allowed the syndicate, led by the Blumenfeld brothers, to dominate the newly legalized liquor trade in Minneapolis. During the same month, the Midwest American also published articles about Kid Can's criminal history and how associate Meyer Schulberg employed him as a salesman for La Pompadour Perfume Factory during Prohibition, which had switched since repeal to producing Chesapeake Brands liquors. Liggett also alleged that the Blumenfelds had been so certain that the city council would grant them a license for Lake Street Liquors that they had begun buying advertisements 10 days before the council's vote. After announcing in print that he had refused offers of both bribes and paid advertisements by AZ syndicate-controlled businesses, Liggett reported on October 2, 1935, that Minneapolis Alderman Henry Banks and Romeo Riley had both attended the prize fight between Joe Louis and Max Baer as personal guests of Kid Can. Liggett also reported that State Liquor Commissioner David Arundel had also attended the fight as a guest of farmer labor fixer and syndicate liquor lobbyist Fred Osana. According to Neil Carlin, Kid Can allegedly claimed to fellow members of Minneapolis's criminal underworld that Liggett was using the Midwest American to try and extort money from him. Blumenfeld allegedly also believed that no journalist would ever dare to report Governor Olson's ties to the AZ syndicate and was outraged when Liggett did so. Liggett was beaten up, prosecuted for a non-existent rape incident, and finally died after being machine-gunned in the alley behind his home on December 9, 1935. His wife and daughter witnessed the assassination, as did several neighbors. All identified Kid Can as the shooter. Kid Can was indicted by a grand jury, and on January 29, 1936, his trial began, where he was prosecuted jointly by the Hennepin County Attorney and the state's attorney's office. Meanwhile, Kid Can's younger half-brother Jacob Blumenfeld, alias Yiddy Bloom, whom many sources allege to have been the acting boss of the organization, resurfaced in Paris. In an interview with the Washington Times, Jacob Blumenfeld called Liggett's murder a terrible extreme, but what the hell. Liggett persecuted the AZ syndicate, which only wanted to live in peace with him. He was fiercely honest and became ridiculously inconvenient. Poor investigative work and a careless trial, however, meant that Kid Can was acquitted. Edith Liggett always believed that Minnesota Governor Floyd Olson and Farmer Labor Party fixer Charles Ward were responsible for setting up her husband's murder. Liggett had repeatedly accused the governor in print of having links to organized crime. Although indicted for shooting dead taxicab driver Charles Goldberg and arrested for the attempted murder of police officer James H. Trepanier, who was left paralyzed, Blumenfeld continued to avoid conviction for serious crimes. According to Twin Cities crime historian Paul Maccabee, FBI files reveal that rival Minneapolis Jewish mob boss David Berman contributed very heavily to Marvin L. Klein's mayoral campaign under the understanding that Berman would receive a monopoly over illegal gambling in Minneapolis. Therefore, during Klein's 1941 to 1945 term as mayor, Berman briefly eclipsed the Blumenfelds and became the leader of the Minneapolis criminal underworld. In 1942, FBI documents described Kid Can as the recognized leader of graft and racketeering in Minneapolis. They added that Blumenfeld was known to have corrupted city and county officials and has been known to harbor criminals of various types. The files also report that Kid Can often boasted that he had the Minneapolis City Council in the palm of his hand. FBI files also allege that he was involved with Bugsy Siegel in the running of the El Cortez Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, Nevada. The December 1944 issue of the Public Press, edited by Walter Liggett-style anti-corruption crusader Arthur Casherman, featured the headline "Klein Administration Most Corrupt Regime in the History of the City." A month later, on the night of January 22, 1945, Casherman was ambushed after eating dinner with a friend and shot dead on a sidewalk at 15th and Chicago Avenues in Minneapolis. His murder made the front pages of newspapers across the Twin Cities, but few in Minneapolis were surprised when the police investigation was quickly shut down. Public outrage over Casherman's murder led, however, to the first term of Hubert Humphrey, who ran for the Minneapolis mayor's office promising to be a racket buster. According to historian Paul Maccabee, however, Humphrey succeeded only in shutting down the far more visible criminal operations of David Berman and leaving those of Tommy Banks and the Blumenfelds largely unscathed. Berman and his associates then moved their operations to Las Vegas, Nevada, and left the Blumenfelds to take their place in Minneapolis. According to journalists Neil Carlin and Bob Patron, Blumenfeld and his brothers made 3 verbal requests to Frank Vitek, the owner of the Swing City Jazz Club at 1682 Rice Street in St. Paul, to either pay protection money to them or hand over control of his club. When Vitek allegedly refused the 3rd time, he was abducted and was dumped with 2 broken legs on the county road, when a permanently crippled Vitek still refused to pay. His club was the target of an arson attack in November 1945. In response to Vitek's continued refusal to sell, Kid Can was allegedly responsible for Vitek's murder by strangulation on March 4, 1946. No one, however, was ever indicted or prosecuted. As the electric streetcar system, operated by Twin City Rapid Transit, was being dismantled in the early 1950s and replaced with diesel buses, Blumenfeld owned a 16% stake in the company. He was later accused of allying himself with an Italian-American Farmer Labor Party fixer turned corporate raider named Fred Asana, and using force to intimidate stockholders to selling. Then, following the success of their hostile takeover and the company's transfer from streetcars to diesel buses, both Kid Can and Asana received significant kickbacks while disposing of the scrap metal from the streetcars. What remained of Twin City Rapid Transit was taken over at the behest of Governor Orville Freeman by noted Minneapolitan Carl Pollard in 1960. In 1954, the Chicago Crime Commission named Kid Can as involved with the Chicago outfit in the jukebox racket. As public interest in organized crime grew over the course of the 1950s, Twin Cities federal agents and prosecutors became increasingly determined to put Blumenfeld and his associates in prison. During the late 1950s, the Immigration and Naturalization Service added Blumenfeld to the Denaturalization and Deportation Program, in the hope of deporting Blumenfeld back to the Socialist Republic of Romania for moral turpitude. Both the INS and the FBI launched an investigation between 1959 and 1960 of Kid Can's sexual activities. According to Blumenfeld's close friend Sid Hartman, however, the federal government's pursuit of the AZ Syndicate was motivated solely by anti-Semitism. Hartman wrote in his memoirs, "It was okay for the Kennedy family in Boston and for some of the families that are now among the wealthiest in the Twin Cities, families living off trust funds in Wayzata, to have made their money in bootlegging. But it drove a lot of people nuts that the Jews were running Minneapolis and still making money in the liquor business." In 1959, he was indicted on federal charges for violating the Mann Act by transporting a Chicago prostitute named Marilyn Tollefson across state lines to work for his prostitution ring in the Twin Cities. Although Blumenfeld's defense counsel read smoky passages from Tollefson's love letters to Kid Can to suggest that it was not just money that lured her across state lines, a federal court found him guilty and sentenced him to 2 years. As this conviction was being appealed, a federal grand jury indicted Kid Can, Fred Lasana, and 6 other executives of the Twin City Rapid Transit Company for mail fraud, wire fraud, and transporting fraudulently obtained property across state lines. All defendants were convicted at trial, except Blumenfeld, who was acquitted of all 13 charges against him. In another federal trial in 1960, the IRS used ownership forms to prove that Blumenfeld, his relatives, and other members of the AZ Syndicate continued to control the Minneapolis liquor industry. He offered a $10,000 bribe to one of the jurors, but was caught within hours. When charged with attempted jury tampering, he pleaded guilty. In an interview with Paul Maccabee, FBI Special Agent Bill Lace recalled sitting with Blumenfeld as he awaited sentencing. "Isadora lit my cigarette for me, took off my coat for me, called me sir." He admitted that he tried to bribe a juror at his trial. Then he said he wanted to send a nice present to my wife. "It was Can's opening gambit to see if I could be bribed too." In 1961, after being accused during sentencing of ordering rigged dice for use in his Twin Cities illegal gambling operations, and of blowing up a business rival's house in Miami Beach, and last but not least, of receiving a cut of the money skimmed from Las Vegas's Sands Hotel and Casino through a strawman named Mr. Isaacs, Kid Can was sentenced by federal judge Edward Devitt to a second 2-year sentence for attempted jury tampering. After his release from prison, Kid Can moved to Miami Beach, Florida with his brothers. They continued to make money through criminal activities, though they changed tack and focused instead on questionable real estate dealings. In 1967, Miami newspapers alleged that Kid Can, Meyer Lansky, and their relatives either owned or had financial stakes in 10 of Miami's best hotels. Blumenfeld and Lansky were also alleged to have set up a labyrinth of businesses, deeds, mortgages, leases, and subleases to conceal their involvement and evade federal income taxes. According to Neil Carlin, Lansky once said of Blumenfeld, "I wouldn't trust that momser bastard with my pocket comb." Carlin adds, however, that Lansky loved Blumenfeld's brothers Harry and Yitty, and could refuse them nothing. Kid Can frequently visited his family and friends in Minnesota. During an interview with a Minneapolis reporter in 1976, Blumenfeld denounced the federal agents and prosecutors who had put him away as his persecutors, and called his conviction under the Mann Act a trumped-up charge that involved a $2 whore Blumenfeld added that he had recently turned down an offer to write his memoirs, saying, "I have nothing to say, really." In 1978, however, Blumenfeld and his brothers were allegedly responsible for manipulating Magic Marker stock prices. According to Paul Maccabee, after the death of legendary Twin Cities Madame Nina Clifford in July of 1929, the AZ Syndicate assigned Blumenfeld's girlfriend, Lillian Lee, to run Clifford's brothel at 147 and 145 South Washington Street in St. Paul. City directories confirm that Lillian Lee, described as a saleswoman, ran the brothel between 1931 and 1934. After several years of living together, Blumenfeld and Lillian Lee were married on August 25, 1936. They had no children, and, following her death, Lillian Blumenfeld was buried next to her husband at Adath Yeshurun Cemetery in Edina. After allegedly returning home to die, Kid Can died in Minneapolis's Mount Sinai Hospital of Heart Disease on June 21, 1981. His death was news from coast to coast. At the time of his death, Isidore Blumenfeld's estate was conservatively estimated at $10 million, according to an obituary in Time magazine, which incorrectly listed his place of death as New York City. Kid Can was also a philanthropist, and, although Jewish, had donated an estimated 10% of his estimated $10 million fortune to churches, as well as to synagogues. When once asked why, Blumenfeld had replied, "I believe in playing all the angles. I'm superstitious." Rabbi Max Shapiro of Temple Israel, the leading rabbi at the largest congregation in the city, and the city's most sought-after eulogist, recited the graveside services and the Kaddish in a driving rain before Blumenfeld's burial at the Adath Yeshurun Cemetery in Edina, Minnesota. Taxi driver Charles Goldberg, whom Blumenfeld shot dead in an allegedly accidental shooting during an argument over a girl in front of Minneapolis's Café Vienna in 1924, lies buried only a few yards away. In an on-site interview with Minneapolis Tribune reporter Bonnie Miller Rubin, mourner Harry Horowitz said of Blumenfeld, "He was a wonderful fellow when a person needed something. He helped out many a person who was broke, who had absolutely nothing. He never forgot his friends, and he always kept the family together." Rabbi Shapiro later recalled, "After Kid Can's funeral, I received a call from someone who asked, how could I possibly officiate at the funeral of such a terrible human being? And I answered, it's my belief that every Jew at death, no matter what he did in life, deserves to have the mourner's Kaddish, the last prayer, said for him. So I said, Kaddish for Kid Can."
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell, so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell, so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Rocco Perri was born in Plati, Calabria, Italy, on December 30, 1887. His family were poor shepherds, and he dropped out of school in 5th grade in the late 19th century. 80% of the people in Calabria were illiterate, and Perri stood out in having at least some literacy. Like many other Calabrians of his generation, Perri as a young man longed to go to America, with the United States being seen as a land of hope, opportunity, and prosperity. He immigrated to the United States in 1903, then to Canada in 1908. He left for Boston in April 1903 aboard the ocean liner SS Republic on a third-class ticket. Perri soon moved to New York City, and then settled in Messina, New York. where he worked as a general laborer. In May 1908, he moved to Montreal in search of work. In November 1908, Perri moved to Ontario and settled in Cobalt, where he worked in a stone quarry owned by the Canadian National Railroad Company. Perri, who disliked the harsh winters in northern Ontario, lived a semi-nomadic life as he lived in Cobalt in the spring and summer, while spending his falls and winters in Toronto. Perri later said of his early years in Canada, "We were treated worse than the blacks, but unlike them, we couldn't speak English." During this period, he began to engage in crime as he wrote coded letters in Italian full of references to furniture and stuff that he was always selling and buying to men with criminal records. In May 1912, Perri hired a man, Camillo Tuzzoni, to burn down a house in North Bay that was owned by Donato Gliona as a part of extortion bid. Tuzzoni, after his arrest for arson, named Perri as the man who hired him. In the spring of 1912, Perri settled in Toronto permanently. In 1912, he met Bessie Starkman, a Polish Jew who had immigrated to Canada in the 1900s, while he lived as a boarder in her family home in the ward, Toronto, Ontario, with her husband Harry Tobin and their 2 children. Shortly after, Perri began an affair with Starkman, and when he got a job working on the Welland Canal in 1913, she left her husband and children to move in with Perri in St. Catharines and begin a common-law relationship. After a few weeks of living with Perri, Starkman attempted to return to her husband, who refused to accept her. Starkman later said of her life with Perri in St. Catharines, "We had no friends. We ate bread and swallowed insults. We were marginalized among those who, as immigrants, were already marginalized." In a letter to his mother in Italy, Perri wrote, "We used to work risking not only our health, but in many cases our lives." When the Canadian government cut funding to the Welland Canal project due to World War I, Perri became unemployed. After working in a bakery, he was hired as a salesman for the Superior Macaroni Company. However, Perri and Starkman found a better means of income when the Ontario Temperance Act came into effect on September 16, 1916. As it restricted the sale and distribution of alcohol. The couple began bootlegging. Using Starkman's business acumen and Perri's connections, they established a profitable enterprise. It was Starkman who suggested bootlegging, but Perri used his network of his Italian friends to create the Perri-Starkman gang. Alcohol was still legal in Quebec, and Perri used his network of friends in Montreal to buy alcohol to smuggle into Ontario. By this time, the 2 lived in Hamilton, Ontario, and by 1920, moved into a larger home at 166 Bay Street South. Perri and Starkman also opened brothels in Hamilton, at the time the city with the highest percentage of its women engaged in prostitution in North America. On March 9, 1917, the Hamilton police raided the house at 157 Caroline Street North, owned by Perri and Starkman, and arrested Starkman for keeping a bawdy house after the police discovered a prostitute, Mary Ashley, engaged in her trade at the house. Starkman was convicted and fined $50. On November 17, 1917, Starkman gave birth to a son by Perri, but the child died after only 2 days. On April 1, 1918, the Dominion government banned alcohol everywhere in Canada, a law that remained in effect until December 31, 1919. Perri and Starkman had to smuggle alcohol from the United States into Canada to maintain their business. In 1918, Perri began an affair with Sarah Olive Routledge, with whom he had 2 daughters, Autumn, born in 1919, and Catherine, born in 1921. After Autumn was born, Perri had refused to marry Routledge, but he did maintain a home for her in St. Catharines and paid child support. Their affair resumed in 1920. Perri's job as a macaroni salesman required travel across Ontario. He also used those trips to arrange the sale of liquor. Starkman, busy running the finances for their organization, did not question Perri's outings. In February 1922, Routledge was falsely told by Perri's lawyer that he was already married to Starkman. Despondent, Routledge committed suicide by jumping from her lawyer's 7th-story office window of the Bank of Hamilton. Her parents took custody of their children. In the 1930s, Perri asked to see his daughters on weekends, although their grandmother would always accompany them for fear that he would take them. On December 31, 1918, Perri and Starkman were hosting a party where two of the guests, Alberto Naticchio and Antonio Martino, become engaged in a dispute. The two men went outside, and Naticchio shot Martino, who died later that night of blood loss. Perri gave the police the false name of Rocco Suseno, which led him to be charged with lying to a police officer when the police discovered his real name. Rocco was charged with selling alcohol on January 3, 1919, and 3 days later was convicted. Perri was fined $1,000, but his lawyer, Michael O'Reilly, had the fine reduced to $700 on an appeal. Starkman was the head of operations and the duo's negotiator and dealmaker until August 13, 1930, when she was ambushed at around 11:15 p.m. as she got out of Perri's car in the garage of the couple's home. Perri ran down the street after the assailants before retreating back to Starkman, who had been killed with 2 shotgun blasts. With tears in his eyes, Perri told reporters the next day, "I'd give up all my money just to have Bessie still here with me. I've lost my best pal." Police found 2 double-barreled shotguns and the getaway car without fingerprints. The investigation eventually resulted in no criminal charges being brought, despite a $5,000 reward offered by Perri. However, it was thought that Calabrian compatriot Antonio Papalia, leader of the Papalia crime family and father of Johnny Papalia, played a role in the murder. The stolen license plates used on the car that Starkman's killers had fled were taken from a car parked in an automobile repair shop where Antonio Tony Papalia worked. Papalia told the police when questioned, "I've got nothing to do with it. But even if I knew something, I certainly wouldn't tell you about it." Perri told the reporters about Papalia's possible involvement. "If it were true, I wouldn't be surprised." 2 weeks after Starkman's murder, Perri had a will written up, saying he was in fear of his life and "I don't trust anybody." Perri added the clause to his will, "I direct that in the event of my death occurring under any unnatural circumstances, that my executor investigate same, and if any of my beneficiaries are in any way suspected of having anything to do with unnatural death, their share of my estate shall be forfeited." On August 17th, about 20,000 people lined the street for the funeral cortege of hundreds of vehicles. Perri fainted at the gravesite. At the funeral, as the rabbi said Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, Perri broke down in tears and fainted. Starkman's headstone in Hamilton's Ohev Zedek Cemetery, commissioned by Perri, referred to her as Bessie Starkman Perri, but the Perri part was later removed by persons unknown. Part of Starkman's estate went to Perri, and the rest to her children. By 1933, Perri was living with another woman, Annie Newman, who helped him to improve his criminal enterprise. The couple profited from enterprises such as bootlegging and drug trafficking. Annie was just as corrupt and businesslike as Bessie, according to one source. In 1943, Newman was imprisoned for smuggling gold. Perri and Starkman survived financially in the few years after 1915 from his income as a macaroni salesman and the grocery store on Hess Street. After the Ontario Temperance Act was passed in 1916, making the sale of alcohol illegal, the couple started selling shots of Canadian whiskey on the side. Their bootlegging was done on a small scale, with their kitchen as the center of operations. Bootlegging became a larger and more profitable enterprise when Prohibition was declared in Canada nationwide on April 1, 1918, and the 18th Amendment that prohibited the sale of alcohol in the United States in 1920. Through the 1920s, Perri became the leading figure in organized crime in southern Ontario and was under constant surveillance by police. The government allowed for numerous exceptions, allowing various breweries and distilleries to remain open for the export market. Perri specialized in exporting liquor from old Canadian distilleries, such as Seagram and Gooderham and Worts, to the United States, and helped these companies obtain a large share of the American market, a share they kept after Prohibition ended in Ontario in 1927 and the United States in 1933. Perri sold alcohol to the Chicago outfit via the Purple Gang of Detroit, and he was described as the largest source of Canadian whiskey in Chicago. He has also been linked as a distributor of Canadian whiskey to New York City's Frank Costello and Chicago's Al Capone. Perri also sold trainloads of liquor into Chicago and Detroit through Niagara Falls and Windsor, Ontario. During Prohibition, the authorities were quite happy to turn a blind eye to bootlegging and also to take payoffs, and Rocco had all the important police in Hamilton on his payroll, according to author Trevor Cole. Stefano Speranza, a member of the Chicago outfit, described Perri as the most powerful boss in Canada. Around 1920, the Ontario underworld was dominated by three crime families: the Scaroni family, based in Guelph, the Seriani family, based in Niagara Falls, and the Gagliardo family, based in Toronto. Perri managed to remain on good ties with all three families for a time, but came to be aligned against the Scaroni family when two Seriani family members, Dominic Speranza and Dominic Perproni, killed a Scaroni family member, Joe Salona. On June 18, 1921, James Saunders, the bodyguard chauffeur for the Scaroni family, was found and murdered outside of Welland via a knife. In his coat pocket was a piece of paper with Perri's home address on it. On May 10, 1922, the boss of the Scaroni crime family, Dominic Scaroni, was killed after being invited to a meeting of organized crime figures in Niagara Falls. At Scaroni's funeral on May 13, 1922, in Guelph, Perri served as one of the pallbearers along with Antonio De Conza, Frank Longo, Frank Romeo, and the D'Agostino brothers. On June 15, 1922, Salvatore Scaroni, the cousin to Dominic, was wounded in a failed murder attempt in Niagara Falls. Scaroni's brother Joe Scaroni, along with Salvatore Scaroni, were killed on September 4th after being driven to a bakery by Perri associates John Trott and Antonio De Conza. Perri was linked to the murders, though no evidence was found. With the Scaroni brothers eliminated, Perri formed an allegiance with the Seriani crime family to keep the Ontario market out of the hands of the Magadino crime family in Buffalo, New York. Perri soon diversified into gambling, extortion, and prostitution. He and Starkman were also reported to have taken part in the narcotics trade as early as 1922, when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police suspected Perri of dealing in narcotics on a large scale. By 1924, when the average wage for a construction worker was $42 per week, Perri and Starkman made an annual profit of $1 million. Perri employed about 100 men and was in charge of the operational aspects of the gang. Starkman, who was more literate than Perri, handled the financial aspects of the business and chose the suppliers of alcohol. Starkman mastered Italian and usually spoke to Perri in the Calabrian dialect of Italian that was his preferred means of speech. By contrast, Perri never learned Yiddish, which was Starkman's first language. Starkman made the alliance with Clifford Hatch, the owner of the Gooderham and Wirtz Distillery that had relocated to Montreal in 1916 after the Temperance Act. Hatch wanted to keep selling alcohol in Ontario, where his brand had been well known ever since Gooderham, and Wirtz had been founded in 1832, while Starkman saw the importance of selling high-quality and safe alcohol to allow the Perri-Starkman gang to seize market share from other bootleggers. Bootleggers often brewed alcohol under unsafe conditions and diluted their alcohol with mineral oil, formaldehyde, acetone, formic acid, sulfuric acid, and creosote. Death and blindness from drinking tainted alcohol were major problems in the 1920s, and drinkers sought out bootleggers who sold safe alcohol. Perri very much wanted British citizenship until 1947. A separate Canadian citizenship did not exist, and on March 13, 1922, he applied for British citizenship in Wentworth County. Perri's citizenship application made the front page news of the Hamilton Herald newspaper, leading to objections from Thora McElroy, the president of the Hamilton chapter of the Citizenship Committee of the local Council of Women. McElroy wrote a public letter stating that Perri is not a man of good moral character and is not a fit person to be naturalized in Canada. On March 24, 1922, William Whatley, the Hamilton police chief, wrote to the Dominion government that Perri had criminal convictions for leaving the scene of an automobile accident in 1918, for lying to a police officer and a breach of the Temperance Act in January 1919, and another conviction in July 1919 for allowing a ferocious dog to be at large. On April 12, 1922, Perri's citizenship application was denied. On May 6, 1922, Perri launched an appeal where he presented himself as misunderstood and maligned. On May 15th, his appeal was rejected with his explanations for his behavior be ruled not very convincing. On November 19, 1924, in an exclusive interview with the Toronto Daily Star, he stated, "My men do not carry guns. If I find that they do, I get rid of them. It is not necessary. I provide them with high-powered cars. That is enough. If they cannot run away from the police, it is their fault. But guns make trouble. My men do not use them." He also did not view himself as a criminal, believing that that prohibition was a law that people did not want. Perri openly admitted that he was a bootlegger, as he told an American journalist, "All I ever did was to sell beer and whiskey to our best people. They call me a bootlegger, and some people call bootleggers criminals. I am simply supplying the demand of millions of law-abiding and law-making citizens. I sell liquor to judges, bankers, senators, governors, mayors, and I have preachers I sell wine to. It is not more criminal to supply this liquor than barter for, possess, and consume it." Perri typically shipped his illegal alcohol into the United States overland, but also owned a boat for crossing Lake Ontario. On December 1, 1926, a boat owned by Perri was seized in Hamilton Harbor with 100 cases of Canadian whiskey meant for the American market. He had a limited business relationship with bootlegger Ben Kerr, who also owned a home on Bay Street. Kerr was described by the Sun as king of the Lake Ontario rum runners, smugglers, who typically used boats. Kerr was operating within Perri's territory, but the latter required Kerr to smuggle raw American alcohol into Ontario, and may also have allowed Kerr to sell alcohol in a certain part of New York State in return for the payment of a commission. These ventures enabled Kerr to expand his operations and to remain a solid customer of distilleries such as Gooderham and Wirtz and Corby's. Kerr and his boat Pollywog disappeared in February 1929. Weeks later, his body and some wreckage from his boat were found on the shore of Lake Ontario near Colborne. Based on his research, author C.W. Hunt theorized that Perri was likely responsible for Kerr's death, perhaps using his own more effectively armored boat, the Uncas. Hunt conceded that there were two other possible causes: misadventure, a marine accident, as stated by the coroner, or an act by the Staud brothers with their well-armed armored boat. One report estimates that in the mid-1920s, Perri and Starkman were generating $1 million per year through criminal endeavors and had 100 employees. In that era, Perri was a big spender, and the couple lived an opulent lifestyle. Nonetheless, Perri paid only $13.30 in income tax, based on employment as a macaroni salesman and his export mail-order business in 1926. Starkman, who claimed to be supporting him, paid $96.43. At about that time, some reports indicated that she had between $500,000 and $1 million in deposits at various banks. That same year, Perri faced criminal charges in the death of 17 people who died after drinking illegal liquor, but was acquitted of the charges. When Perri turned himself in to face the manslaughter charges in Hamilton on July 31, 1926, it was the biggest news story in the American and Canadian newspapers that day. Even the United States President Calvin Coolidge spoke about Perri's arrest at a press conference at the White House, which he used as evidence that the Canadian authorities were trying to stop bootlegging into the United States. A woman involved in bootlegging, Mildred Cooney Sterling, told an undercover policeman on August 26, 1926, "No one would ever dare to go against Rocco Perri. He is entirely too powerful." About the tainted alcohol that had caused the deaths of 45 people in Ontario and New York State, she added that Perri had smuggled in the toxic alcohol, but he would, under all circumstances, prevent the poison liquor from coming in. Rocco Perri and other millionaire rum runners don't have to handle poisonous liquor, because they can make more money with less trouble by handling the straight goods. On January 13, 1927, Perri was acquitted when the Crown was unable to establish that he was aware that the alcohol was tainted. On June 1, 1927, alcohol was legalized in Ontario again. However, the Ontario government forced bars and liquor stores to close early, which still made bootlegging in Ontario profitable, as many people wanted to drink past the early closing time. In 1927, Rocco Perri was compelled to testify at the Royal Commission on Customs and Excise Inquiry, focusing on bootlegging and smuggling, and also at a hearing on tax evasion charges against Gooderum and Wirtz. Later that year, at the Gooderum and Wirtz tax evasion hearing, he admitted to buying whiskey from the distiller from 1924 to 1927. Gooderum and Wirtz was convicted of tax evasion in 1928 and ordered to pay a fine of almost $450,000. Perri and Starkman were charged with perjury after their Royal Commission testimony, but in a plea bargain. The charges were dropped against Starkman. Rocco served 5 months of a 6-month sentence and was released on September 27, 1928. On June 15, 1929, an undercover officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Frank Zaneth, reported to his superiors that he had learned that Rocco Perri was the big gun in the smuggling and distribution of narcotic drugs in this province. On May 26, 1930, Giuseppe Penestri, who used the alias Joe Leo, vanished in Sudbury. Leo left behind a note in a safe deposit box which warned that if he vanished, it would be a case of murder, as he accused 2 Perri associates, Domenico and James D'Agostino, of plotting his murder so they can take my wife and my money. The body of Leo was never discovered. On August 2, 1930, Perri and Mike Surge were charged with illegal possession of 10 gallons of liquor, but 9 days later, both men were acquitted. Starkman was murdered on August 13, 1930. Perri started relations with Joe Leo's widow, Maria Vincentia Rossetti, who used the alias Jessie Leo. In October 1930, Jessie Leo confirmed her relationship with Perri to journalists and hinted she would marry him. By 1931, the Great Depression had led to a 31% unemployment rate in Ontario, and the Canadian authorities openly tolerated Perri's bootlegging into the United States as a way to reduce unemployment. In response to threats from the United States government to raise tariffs on Canadian goods, the Canadian government banned the export of alcohol. In turn, the bootleggers took to smuggling Canadian alcohol into the United States via Cuba and Mexico, a choice of routes that hurt Perri financially. Perri's bodyguard, chauffeur Frank DiPietro, later stated, "He felt cornered, as if everyone was plotting against him. He acted in a strange way. In one day alone, he lost $100,000 at the racetrack." On October 5, 1932, the Hamilton police raided a hose on Concession Street, where 26,000 gallons of whiskey meant for the United States was seized. Charged were Mary Latica, Perri's maid, and Tony Mirando, Perri's cousin. The raid costed Perri $28,000 in inventory. The end of Prohibition ended Perri's main source of income and led to engage in new crimes such as counterfeiting. By the 1930s, Perri had become legendary figure in his native Calabria, with popular rumor having it that he was the richest man in Canada. In 1937, Perri returned to Toronto, where he purchased a house with his new common-law wife, Annie Newman. To support himself, Perri turned to running a network of illegal gambling houses in Toronto. Between 1937 and 1939, Perri owned a brewery on Fleet Street in Toronto. In 1938, 2 attempts were made to kill Perri. On March 20th, his veranda was destroyed by dynamite that had been placed underneath it, and on November 23, a bomb under his car detonated. Perri was not injured in either attempt. Rocco was the prime suspect behind the murder of a Toronto bookie, James Windsor, who was competing with his gambling houses. While interviewing Perri, 2 Toronto police detectives, Ori Young and Herbert Whitton, noticed a .25 caliber pistol in the living room. Annie Newman claimed that gun was hers, and she was fined $25 on January 12, 1939 for owning an illegal gun. 2 weeks later, Rocco was charged with the corruption of public officials, with the Crown alleging that he had bribed 7 customs officers in Windsor to assist with his struggling across the border. One of the customs officers, David Armley, had agreed to turn Crown's evidence and testified that Perri had bribed him, as he received $25 for every one of Perri's cars that were allowed to cross into the United States uninspected. On the same day that he was arrested, Perri was interviewed by journalists, with the discussion turning to the Danzig crisis. Italy signed the Pact of Steel with Germany earlier that year, and several journalists asked what Perri would do if Italy were at war with Britain. Perri replied, "Canada is my country. Canada is part of the British Empire. I would fight for it. I left Italy more than 25 years ago. I don't remember much about it." The next day, the Daily Toronto Star ran as its headline, "War worries Rocco, he's ready to fight." Perri was defended at his trial by Paul Martin Sr., who always so well informed about the Crown's case that it was believed that one of the Crown attorneys was selling information, but which Crown attorney was never established. Martin made much of the fact that Armley had engaged in welfare fraud, which he used to paint him as a man engaged in perjury. On February 1st, 1940, Rocco Perri was acquitted. In 1940, Perri and his brother Mike were arrested and sent to internment at Camp Petawawa as part of the Italian-Canadian internment, as potentially dangerous enemy aliens with alleged connections to Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested Perri, along with Antonio Papalia, Frank Silvestro, Mike Sergi, John Taglerino, and Charles Del Castro of Hamilton, along with Dominic Longo and Dominic Belcastro of Guelph. A group of Mounties arrived at Perri's Hamilton house, where he was arrested without incident. One prisoner at Camp Petawawa, Osvaldo Giacomelli, recalled, "Perri never gave himself airs. He played cards often, but he avoided any conversation concerning activities that he was supposedly involved in." Perri was described as a well-behaved and polite prisoner who suffered from depression as 1941 turned into 1942. During this internment, Perri served some time with Antonio Papalia, who was released 2 years before Perri. When Perri saw Papalia arrive at Camp Petawawa, he shouted at him in Italian, "I should slap you black and blue." Papalia replied, "Just try," and only the prompt intervention of the guards stopped a brawl between the two gangsters. When he returned to his tent, Perri swore like he'd never been seen to do before, as he cursed Papalia as a friend who had betrayed him. Perri was greatly angered by the way that Papalia had allied himself with his old enemy, Stefano Magadino. Upon his release, Papalia then began to expand his enterprise with his son Johnny, who had some relationship with the Buffalo crime family. On October 17, 1943, the Justice Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, ordered Perri released. During this, Perri found that Ontario underworld was now dominated by Papalia, Bordonaro, and Silvestro, who were serving as the agents of Magadino, who did not want Perri involved in the underworld again. Rocco Perri was last seen alive in Hamilton on April 23, 1944, at the home of a cousin Joe Surge on Murray Street West. According to a Maclean's magazine report from June 15th of that year, Perri was then working as a doorman in a Toronto theater. Before lunch, he complained of a headache and went for a walk to clear his head but never returned. Perri's body has never been found, though it is speculated he was murdered by being fitted with cement shoes and thrown into Burlington Bay, a practice known colloquially as the Lupara Bianca. It is believed Antonio and Johnny Papalia, along with Stefano Magadino of Buffalo, played a role in Perri's disappearance to gain better control of the Canadian alcohol market. In 1944 to 1945, the Papalias hunted down and killed all of Perri's allies, such as Joan Durso and Louis Wernick, which completed Magadino's control of the Ontario underworld. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police concluded in 1954 that they won't find his body until the bay dries up. After Perri's disappearance, 3 of his former lieutenants, in addition to Papalia and Giacomo Lupino, began answering to Magadino in Buffalo.